Do you like what you hear? Then you need a Devon bass. Devon bass. Better by design. Whether you're old school or whether you're new school, we discuss it all for the only one that matters. Christian Talk with Christian musicians. There you are, brother.
How are you, Paige?
Just trying to stay out of trouble and out of jail. How you doing?
Is it working?
Hang on a second. I don't see the cops here. We're good.
Okay, fantastic.
I figure we got 10 minutes before they show up. Yeah, it's funny. I just got off a really interesting interview with my son, who's a record producer, though there's no records anymore. Well, that vinyl's starting to come back. But he's a record producer, elementary school music teacher, and he just became a music director at his little Presbyterian church. And we talked about worship music, and it was, I got some questions I'd like to talk to you about that. You and I come from pretty much the same kind of background, and that young whippersnapper just didn't experience the 70s and 80s like we did.
He's probably better off.
Yeah.
He may live longer.
Yeah, I know, right? Hang on a second. I got to make sure I put him in the right spot here. I've got, hang on a second. Zoom interviews. That's what I get for scheduling these things back to back like this. Matt, there we go. And there. Got it. All right. Cool. Okie doke. All right. Well, dude, folks, if I guess you can see the name up here. His name's Mark White. He's a friend of mine. And we were like pretty much two ships passing in the night at a church, at Westridge Church. I played there for a lot of years, and then he kind of came in after me, and he's one of these players that whenever I watch him play, I think, yeah, I got to get to know that guy. Because from just a pure bass player's perspective, dude, you groove. You understand you understand that word. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that today too. One of the things, my goals for this discussion is not only just to get to know you better, but also us old road warriors, us old dogs, we got some stuff to teach the young pups. And I want to explore some of that with you. Okay. I don't know if this has been your experience. I imagine it has, because almost everybody I've talked to is the same thing. When I was much younger, chops were everything, right? Stanley Clarke was the guy. Jocko was the guy when I was a young bass player. And so I'd learn the chicken, Stanley Clarke thing. I mean, the Jocko thing. And then I'd learn something from Return to Forever, like the introduction to So Long Mickey Mouse and all that kind of stuff. And chops were everything. Fast was everything. And now I'm to the point where, I'm listening to the backbeat from the drummer, and I'm filling in 1 and 3, and let the guitar player have all the show. I'm just going to lock this bottom end down, which also coincides with my moving away from the 6-string and 7-string basses back to just a plain old P bass 4-string.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to the dark side. We have cookies. So, first of all, just go ahead and tell those folks who are listening a little bit about yourself, what you're doing, and I'll probably interrupt at some point because that's what I do best.
Well, currently, at this point in time, I'm playing secular music and sacred music. Play at a local church here in the Pensacola area. Play bass and guitar for them, depending on what they need. And then also got some secular projects where I play with some pretty good players, and we do covers. I'm in a Steve Miller tribute band, of all things. And yeah, at first I was like, what an odd thing to be a tribute band of. But it's actually been very gratifying because we do not only Steve Miller, but we kind of do Steve Miller and Friends. So we do other bands of his generation, like Steely Dan and
Oh my goodness.
yeah, the REO Speedwagon and
Peg.
Billy Joel. Yeah, exactly. We do Josie, which is very satisfying. So that's what I'm currently doing, is both secular and sacred music.
Awesome. So now, sticking with that, what is the difference between secular and sacred? How would you define that?
To me, they're very different. They can be equally as satisfying, but the approach for me is very different. So, as far as secular is concerned, I guess to address it, I kind of have to take it back to when I started playing. So, junior high, high school, I was like most guys. I was into sports and music. Found out very quickly that I had no God-given ability whatsoever in sports. As much as I tried, I was just terrible. And so when you're that age and you're thinking, well, how am I going to meet girls if I stink at sports? Well,
dude, you're telling my story.
That long hair over there with a six string seems to be doing all right. So in junior high, I picked up the six string guitar at 13 years old. Peter Frampton Comes Alive album was huge, and he was one of my guitar heroes. Got into high school playing six string, was in a band with a bunch of fellas, and we lost our bass player. And of the three guitarists, I was probably trying to think of a nice way to put it. I stunk.
You were the third best guitar player
out of all three of us.
Yes.
And so I was voted to take up the bass, and as luck would have it, I had a proclivity for it. I actually enjoyed it, and it took off from there, where I forgot about six string for a while and just concentrated on the four strings and learned.
Funny story here. My story is almost exactly like yours. I was a bassoonist. Now, one of the reasons I started playing bassoon was because I thought it was esoteric and eclectic enough that it would make me a chick magnet. Unfortunately, learning to play the bassoon didn't bring any girls within my periphery. And I started playing guitar because, like you, I noticed chicks dig guitar players. So now, freshmen in high school, we're sitting in concert band, a small town, Southeast Alaska. Our band director said, we're starting a jazz band in January. I need a bass player. Well, my former best friend, Greg Gauker, sitting next to me, raised my hand up into the air. He said, all right, Garwood, you're a bass player. Have a bass after Christmas. I went, what? And, but like you, I discovered that this is really cool. And the girls started showing up. So less emphasis on bassoon, more emphasis on bass. And I dated a pretty girl almost any time I wanted.
Well, it was nice that the girls paid attention, but the more I got into it, the more I wanted to get better at it. Mm-hmm. And so then, to your point, started listening. Back in those days, it was Stanley Clarke, it was Billy Sheehan, and Faster is Better. And I learned very quickly that I was not Billy Sheehan and I was not Stanley Clarke, but I could be a paler version of James Jamerson, or some of the other dudes that Bootsy Collins, some of those guys that held down the bottom end, didn't overplay. Less is more. The groove is sacred. Those are the guys I follow.
Tower Power. Who's that? Verdine?
Verdine's in Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Earth, Wind, and Fire. Yeah, I always throw those two together. King of the groove.
Absolutely. And it's not, he doesn't play over his head. It's just very solid. And I don't know, I was drawn to that. And so secular music, I started playing in cover bands at 16 years old, playing the clubs, which was unusual to be 16 years old playing clubs. But it gave me an opportunity to play with guys that were way better than me. And you know as well as I do, music is kind of like sports. Hey, you want to get better at golf? You hang around with guys that are good at golf. You want to get better at music? You play with guys that are better at music than you are, that either pull you up or you're going to get left behind.
I always, I never liked being the big fish in the pond. I always liked.
I never had to worry about it.
Yeah, I always It didn't happen to me very often. When I went to the Armed Forces School of Music, when I was in high school, I was the man. And of course, I reveled in that, and because its reputation's everything. But you get out of Sitka, Alaska, 7,000 people, and you come down to the lower 48, where there's bazillions of people, and you go to the Armed Forces
cool.
School of Music, one of the premier school of music in the world. And I went from being the guy to one of 5 bass players at the School of Music in that particular class. And of those 5 bass players, I was the 5th best bass player when I entered. And I practiced hard. I put in 25 plus hours a week on the bass, did well in my lessons, blah, 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 blah. And after all that time of hard work and dedication and practice, I graduated 5th of 5. I never made it out of the basement. But I was surrounded by the best musicians. Right. One of my classmates was a trombone player in Buddy Rich's band. Wow. Another one of my classmates was a Barry sax player for Maynard Ferguson. Had all Maynard Ferguson's charts in his head, transcribed Man from La Mancha from his head, out of his head. Wow. So our big band got to play that stuff. So, I mean, I'm surrounded by people like that. And then I get out to my first band, Navy Band San Francisco, and I'm playing with guys who traveled with Lou Rawls, Frank Sinatra. I mean, we're talking heavy hitter. And so I never really made it out of the basement as far as musicianship goes. But when you're around people like that, they yank you up to their level. Yep. And you scrap and you scrabble and you become a much better player. So I'm with you. If you want to be a good player, you can't be the big guy on stage. You're not going to grow.
To your point, I don't have the music theory background that you do. I'm not quite the accomplished player that you are, but there's one thing that I do have, and that's the want to woodshed. And I guess I just heard about this recently. I guess it's the imposter syndrome. I'm not going to be the weak link on the stage. I never will be, because I am going to come in so hyper prepared that I cannot fail. And so that's kind of how I approach secular, and, to be quite honest, a good segue into sacred music. One thing I don't talk about probably enough is that before I became a Christian, I was a stone cold atheist.
Really?
And it was, yes. Yeah, I was my own deity, Paige. I didn't need a God. I was my own. I loved me, a whole lot of me. And
all the time.
Exactly, 24/7. And it wasn't until I met my wife and she started taking me, told me if we're going to date, that I had to start going to church with her.
Dude, my wife did the same thing when we were dating. She wasn't going to marry me if I, and yeah. Dude, are you sure we're not related somewhere in our background?
We may be. So you're going to love this. The first praise and worship musician I ever was wowed by was Sonny Lallerstedt. He was playing.
I love me some Sonny Lallerstedt.
He was playing at Orange Hill Baptist in Georgia, and Sheila took me to see them, and I thought he was incredible. And I told her, wow, I've got to play with that guy. One day I'm going to play with that guy. Well, I ended up playing in Sonny's band at North Metro for years.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, so moving from atheism to becoming a believer, and then getting an opportunity to worship our Lord through music and song, I don't take that lightly. That's an amazing blessing, and something that I take very, very seriously.
There's a story. Eric Liddell, he was a Scottish missionary in the early 1900s. And he and his sister were going to go be missionaries in China, and they were in England, Scotland, and they were raising money for their missionary journey. But at the same time, he'd been selected by the United Kingdom to represent them in the Olympics. He was a middle distance runner, world-class runner. And so he's out running all the time, and his sister just could not understand why the obsession. She said, "Why are you running so much?" And his response was so perfect. He says, "Because God made me run fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." He was awesome. Doing what God made him to do, being what God made him to be. And he saw it as an act of worship.
Absolutely.
And that applies to us as musicians when we're doing what God, you know, when we're walking with him and we play music because he's made us a musician. For years, I used to think God made me a musician so that I could serve him in the body of Christ. That was my focus.
Mhm.
I found out later that's totally out of order and wrong. God blessed me with the gift of music because he loves me. That's it. Whether I play it in church or by myself out in the middle of a forest where nobody can hear, it makes
Right.
no difference. When I pick up my bass to play or my guitar to play, when I sing, God is honored because I'm doing what he made me to do. I'm being what he made me to be. And
Agreed.
so it's kind of cool to see your experience following that trajectory.
But to use the gift that he gave us as an act of worship back to him,
Is the ultimate.
that's, oh my gosh, bro, it is the ultimate. It really is. And so I take it very seriously. Sometimes I have to temper my seriousness because, again, as I said, I'm a woodshedder, and I expect perfection of myself, and especially if I'm worshiping God. And so I have to temper it sometimes because other people don't approach it with the same approach that I do, with the same passion that I do. And
All
so
right.
sometimes I have to temper my expectations of others and
Oh my
just
gosh.
remember that I can expect it of myself, but it's not fair of me to expect it of others.
Oh my word. We are brothers from another mother. All right. I was at Westridge, as you know, for lots of years. And Steve was gone for a couple, 3 weeks. And I was asked to fill in for him, direct the worship team. And after the first week, I went to the pastor, Brian, and said, we got to find somebody else to do this. He said, yeah, I heard about rehearsal. What had happened was that I had sent out the music ahead of time and said, look, and I told him, look, here's my philosophy. Our rehearsal time is not the place to learn the song.
Exactly.
Come in knowing the song. You don't have to have it perfect, but come in and know the song, basically. And our rehearsals where we learn to play together.
Right.
We don't teach the song here. We play together here. And
there's practice and there's rehearsal.
Thank you so much. And so anyway, I'd laid into him pretty harsh. And later on, a couple years later, do you remember Rodney Hunt?
I do remember Red. Yeah.
Yeah, he was on staff there. I'd lost my job, and I'd gone to him. It was a dark time for me, and he was like just walking me through some stuff. And he gave me a test, spiritual gifts test, and all that kind of stuff. And my spiritual gifts have always shown up. My primary ones are teaching, administration, and prophecy. But he said, I can tell you why you're not going to be a worship pastor or a preacher someday. I said, why? He said, you got the teaching, administration, prophecy. That's all good and groovy, good stuff. But he says, the gift of mercy, you're at 2%. He said, you'll never be a worship pastor because nobody would survive the rehearsal. So, I mean, the minute you started talking to me about I'm going,
That's
oh,
funny.
I know this guy. He's me.
Yep.
And so I totally understand God's wisdom by not unleashing me in the body of Christ in that capacity, because there would be bodies everywhere.
I understand. And that's why I try to understand my role. And I, again, temper my enthusiasm, because I can be a good source of information to some of the younger players, but I'm a terrible I'm too much of a taskmaster, and I don't want to steal their joy of playing because I'm expecting perfection and have over expectations for them. And let's face it, Paige, a lot of the praise and worship bands that we play with are volunteer armies.
Yes.
And they have other things that they have to do, family and work and things that takes their attention away. And
Yes.
maybe they don't approach it the same way we do. And so it's been difficult for me to temper that, but I've learned that I've had to.
Well, they don't have the luxury that you and I have. Like, my life is all music now. Every day I get up and something musical is happening in my life. I'm giving a lesson, virtual or in person. I'm composing music. I'm playing, practicing, doodling. Every day, 7 days a week now, it's all about music. And it's been that way since 2001 when I lost my gig as a network engineer. And um, and I have to remember, like you said, not everybody has that luxury.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, with the crap lives that some of our folks are living, with the stuff they're going through, uh, this Sunday is Sunday playing is as much a ministry to them
True.
as a point of release, and just a point of just for an hour and a half, I don't have to think about this garbage at home. I can think about this song. And and I totally get that. And I've had to redefine my role as a musician within that context. And I'm a very take charge personality. I'm a big believer that the best job to have is when you're in charge. That's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
But it leads me, if I perceive a vacuum in leadership, I'll ram myself into that. Whether I'm a square peg going into a round hole or not, I will force myself into that. That's my tendency, is to take charge when nobody wants to. And that's been my biggest struggle. And as a bass player, we drive the bus in a lot of respects, at least us and the drummer. And dude, get on the bus.
Yeah.
And
I understand what you're saying. And a lot of times I've been asked to be musical director, which means my microphone is only heard in the ears of the players.
Mm-hmm.
Their microphones are heard by the congregation. And so I'm the guy and as you know, a lot of us use tracks and click tracks and vocal cues. And so technology fails us sometimes. And so I'm the guy that has to be there just in case technology fails, and I can help the band remember where we are in the song and things along those lines. But yeah, I found that I've had to do what you're talking about. I used to be the guy that tried to fill the void and be the leader when they needed a leader. And I've had to learn with humility that it's okay just to be an Indian and not be a chief, especially at this point in life. I'm a grandfather now. I have other interests.
Dude, isn't that the best?
Oh, that's God's way of reminding us he loves us.
You know, like I said, I told somebody the other day, if I'd known grandkids were going to be this cool, I'd have had them first.
I describe it as think of the entity you love and adore the most, and that entity hands you their baby, the thing that they love and cherish the most. That's 2 degrees of love and cherishing, and it's a little more than my Grinch heart can stand sometimes.
I totally get that.
Going back to the point, I'm okay in a role of being an Indian at this point in life. I've tried to lead things. I have led things. I've been the backbone a lot of times, but I'm okay with just being the bass player, and that's okay by me.
You know, it's funny. We both talked about Cliff Davies. We both knew him. You studied piano with him for a time, right?
I did, yeah, for a short period of time.
I love the guy, and he was a troubled man. And you know his story. He was out on the West Coast doing some work, ran out of his medicines that he had for his depression, and then he came back, and he couldn't get a doctor out there to fill his prescription. So he's 2 weeks out off his meds, all of a sudden, hardcore off, comes back home, gets his medications from his doctor again, and goes hardcore back on it. Well, you just don't do that with the kind of meds he was taking. And he had a psychotic break, and he died. But I got so much from this guy. He was an atheist, and he was one of 2 atheists I've ever met that were atheists by conviction and not because they were angry at the church for anything. He honestly,
very good distinction.
Yes, it's huge. He honestly believed. He came to it through his own research and reasoning and all that kind of stuff. And so we have lots of discussions about God. But I was his go-to bass player in the studio for a while, and what he taught me about playing in an ensemble ran so counter to what I believed at the time. And his wisdom was so. He said, "Look, don't think like a bass player when you're in a band. Think like a record producer. And think like you're producing. You're standing outside the band, you're listening to the different elements, and ask yourself this question: as a bass player, how can I help the drummer? as
Mm.
a bass player? How can I help the singer? How can I make it so that the singer is so confident where the downbeat is that she doesn't have to think about anything but singing her song, and she could float the melody behind the beat, ahead of the beat, whatever. What can you do to make that happen? What can you do to make the drummer absolutely can close his eyes and groove because he knows you and him are walking this walk together? And he says, think like a record producer. Don't think like a bass player, because it's not about you. It'll never be about you. And
That's a great way to look at it.
it was, I love that man. He was so, and then when we were like doing a jazz gig, one time I did a first jazz gig with him. He was a hard taskmaster. He's hard to play for as a bassist because, dude, he's played with some of the biggest names in the world, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just this short little fat white guy from Dallas, Georgia. But he would say, like in a jazz gig, he'd say, now when we're doing the rock or pop thing, you listen to my kick drum, good. But when I'm doing jazz thing with you, you're the timekeeper. Don't pay any attention to me. He says, I'm going to dance. He said, I'm going to dance around you. My kick drum, who knows where the crap that thing's going to end up. He says, you're walking. He says, you're the timekeeper. I dance around you. But when we're in a pop or rock gig, we dance together. That was the most valuable piece of information I think I have gotten in years. And I wish I'd known it 30 years previous when I was playing big bands. Could have used that then, Cliff.
You're years too late, but still you got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a very interesting fellow.
He had a doctorate, I think, or at least a master's in musicology. He knew more about anything in music than anybody I've ever known. I mean, I never stumped him musically. And I am like an endless well of music trivia, music theory nonsense. When I went to get my master's degree in composition, he says, what do you want to do? I said, I want to compose a 13th century medieval choral piece. And he said, nobody writes like that anymore, right? I said, yeah, I know. How cool is that? I mean, that's me. So I learned a lot of stuff that I'll never use anywhere.
That's funny.
But it's funny being an old dog. Yeah, and you see all these young folks coming up. What do you think is your biggest contribution to the music scene where you're at, in the group you're in the church you're in? What do you bring to the table that they need?
I'd like to think that number one, as a bass player, the groove is sacred. So I'm there to help preserve the groove.
The groove isn't everything. The groove is the only thing.
Exactly. That's a really good question. Other than being a knowledge base for some of the younger players to give them some pointers if they want them. They don't always want them, but if they want them, just to be the backbone of the band and go less is more, and not try to you said it earlier, there ain't nobody there to see me. So as long as I can preserve the integrity of the song and do it in a tasteful way with my rhythmic friend, the drummer, I think that's my main role.
Now, how do you know you're doing your job in the church music world? What's your indicator that you're doing it right?
I don't think it's different than the secular world, honestly. I mean, as long as, again, protecting the integrity of the song, and if the drummer and I are syncopated and working well together, I think that's when the magic happens, and that's when you're doing it right. I mean, I'm sure you've played with drummers that just by a glance, you both know where you're going and what you're going to be doing, and others that may be excellent musicians, but you don't have any chemistry with them whatsoever. And it gets frustrating. Then it's like, this dude's a monster. Why can't we get it together?
Because and the thing is, he doesn't care about you. It's all about him. You're hitting on it, because it's like Charlie Korch. Do you know that name?
I don't.
All right, he's a drummer, Metro Atlanta drummer. He is probably Atlanta's best kept secret on drums. Him and George Sandler, both incredible drummers, and both just, it's like anybody who's anybody in the Atlanta music scene knows who those two guys are. And I played with Charlie Korch, in a blues band, the Rhythm Raiders, for a couple of years. And the minute we played together, it was like we'd been playing together for 50 years.
Right.
It's like I had this instinctive knowledge. I really quickly caught on to how he sets his fills up, and he quickly caught on to some signature groove things that I do. And we never had to talk. It was just, we'd be doing a gig, and I just look over at him, and he'd know I was telling him, do that triplet thing on the toms, something like that. And then I'd put a fill that would just marry itself to it. And but I've been with other drummers that have just been the most incredible drummers on the face of the planet. And their eyes are closed. They're listening to them.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
And you can't touch them. You can't reach them, and you can't communicate with them. And at that point, I have to do my best to follow him. We're not dancing together. Right. I'm running after him on the track.
The first time I really experienced where I really felt like I was truly in sync totally with the drummer was when I was playing with Sonny Lallerstedt. He had a drummer named Wayne, and Wayne was a short little white guy like me. Both of us were bald at the time. Both of us looked like 40-year-old accountants.
Yeah, you do have that. You do have that Clark Kent thing happening.
But Wayne Lewis, was just a wonderful drummer. He played a great pocket, but played within himself. He never stretched out too far to get himself in trouble. And we could just look at each other, glance at each other, and know where we were going. And then on the back end, if Wayne did a nasty fill and I happened to read him right, and I did a nasty little bass run with it, we just look at each other with smiles and try not to be too giddy, because we're still playing worship music. But it was very satisfying, and it was musically very satisfying.
So it'd be like, it's all you can do not to go, damn, that was good.
Well, we both just smirk at each other or wink at each other.
I got it.
Oh, bro, that was tasty.
It's really funny. You brought up another thing there. You said he plays within himself. What do you mean by that? I know what you mean, I think.
Not that he doesn't take musical chances, because he will, but I guess the proof is in the pudding. They always work out. He doesn't play over his head where he gets lost, or the fills didn't work, or they didn't fit. He just plays. He had a very keen sense of musical self, and played within it. And I really admired him for it, because I knew he was capable of more, but he didn't do more.
Well, it's the phrase that comes to mind when I hear you saying that is, the gig isn't the place to practice.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, and it's, you should always have. I had a band leader tell me once. He said, "Never come." He told me this. I was doing a recording session. He says, "Don't come to my next recording session and make me ask you for less, or I won't call you back. Always come to a recording session and make them ask you for more, and have something in the tank to give them."
There it is.
And so for us bass players, that's doom. Hey, can you put something on the end of that? And he says, always make him ask you for more. Never make him ask you for less, because it's exhausting to be around a busy player.
I could agree with that.
And that's kind of where I hear you coming from with that. So if you had a room full of young players in front of you, we're talking 20-somethings, and they're coming into the church music scene, and you have their attention for a short amount of time, what are you going to tell them? What's important? And these could be guitar players, drummers, bassists, keyboard players, singers, whatever. What do they need to know that you know?
You don't have to play here. You get to play here. You get the honor of playing for our Lord in worship.
All right, wait a minute. Hang on a second. Have you been talking to my son? Because my son says you don't have a right to play in church. It's not your right just because you're a musician that
Right.
you need to play here because you're a musician. You don't have to play here. You get those are his words. You get to play here.
Exactly. And no matter, I mean, let's face it, sometimes you get frustrated. Sometimes you didn't have enough time to woodshed and know your chops. And sometimes it can be frustrating when it's a volunteer army and you can't get on them too much for not coming prepared. But always
where
to remember,
were you at that rehearsal? Sure could have used your help then.
always to remember, though, that we get to do this and what an honor it is. And no matter how frustrated or disappointed I may get, that's what I always come back to. That's my center, is we get to do this. This is a form of worship. God has given us gifts and we get to use those gifts to honor him. Brother, how can it get better than that? It just can't.
You know, it's interesting. I played it for a while. I played at a church, and after almost every church service, the difference between this other church and the church I'm at now is like night and day. At this other church, the worship community were held up as icons almost. And after almost every church service, somebody come up and said, "Man, you were really ripping in on the bass today." Or if I was playing guitar, "Man, you were really bringing it on the guitar today." And outside, I say thank you because that's polite. Inside, I'm going, "You were listening to the wrong guy." You know, if your focus is on me, either I'm doing something wrong here to draw that attention, or you haven't been taught where your attention needs to be. But my heart was broken. Well, at the church I'm at right now, Burnt Hickory, and the musicianship here is every bit as good as it's been anywhere else I've ever played. We have some hard hitting players, and I'm not the best bass player in the house, and I love that. But now almost, if somebody says anything, they'll come up to me today after church, after the church service, say, "Man, it was like God was sitting in the seat next to me."
Whoa.
And I'm going, "Oh, Jesus, they get it."
There it is.
And I think that's the dance we as Christian musicians have to dance in church. The thing that makes church gig different than a secular gig, it's all notes. There are no sacred notes, secular notes. It's all notes. But I think what makes a church gig is that we have to learn to dance the dance of playing in such a way that they see Jesus, they hear Jesus, they don't see or hear me. And that might mean me dialing it back. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson I pulled out of church music, is that if I'm just, as a bass player, if I'm just grooving, just making that pocket a mile wide and a mile deep, they don't know what it is about the music that feels so good. Their uneducated ear doesn't know that it's all about the groove in the pocket. They just know that all of a sudden they can go and get sucked into whatever where the music is taking them. I was in a worship band once, and I hired myself out I got hired to do a session gig, and I fired myself from that gig because I couldn't find the pocket if I had a flashlight and an Indian guide. Man, oh God, it was terrible. And I called up a friend of mine, session player out of Seattle, Mark Miller. And so what do I do? He said, "I'll tell you, but only if you're going to listen. If you're not going to listen, dude," I think I've told you the story. And he went on to, he said, "You're in a church band. Next Sunday, I want you to go in and do just whatever the drummer's doing his kick drum. That's your rhythm pattern. And only play the root of each chord." He said, "Tell those happy hands of yours to stay home." So I did that the next Sunday. So it's just like, if the drummer's going boom, 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 I was going boom, 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 boom. And I just followed the kick drum. And at the end, we always went to a green room where we deconstructed the service, what worked, what didn't. And I walked in, the whole room's a buzz. And they're going, "Man, it was tight today. What's the difference?" "Don't know. Man, it just felt so good." It's like, the pocket was, and I'm sitting in the background going, "I'm the reason we sucked for 2 years."
It's on me.
Yeah, it's on me. But the point is that when you do it right, the attention gets shifted to the right place. And if the attention's on you, it's like that movie, Mr. Mom. You ever see that one?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, where he's driving the kids. "You're doing it wrong, moron." Driving his kids. That's the voice in my head. when people come up and the attention was on me, odds are there's a possibility that I'm doing it wrong. And I think that's probably where in a secular gig, it's all about the show.
Absolutely. It's entertainment. I always look at it as
Yes.
In sacred music, we're the conduit to worship. We should be the vehicle that's taking people closer to God and in a spirit of worship.
Yes.
In the secular gig, it's entertainment, man. So yeah, will I throw in a few more? Heck yeah. Will I show dog a little bit more? Heck yeah. Will I play in a different way than I would at church? Absolutely. But I'm getting paid money to entertain so that people wherever we're playing will at the end of the show go, man, what a great time. That bass player was pretty good. Whereas at church, nobody should be worrying about what I'm playing. They should be so focused on the worship that we're just the conduit. We're just the vehicle.
Yes. You know, it's funny. It's the fine art of being the fine art of being a worship musician is such that play with the same level of excellence, but in such a way that you don't get attention.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
We're still called to play excellently. But, you know, somebody said, what's the hardest gig in the world? I said, oh, that's easy. Church gigs. They said, why? There's just simple little pop tunes. Yeah.
A little bit more to it than that.
Yeah. I says, now, I would play an Elton John tune differently than I would play the same changes in a church setting. They said, why? I said, because I've got to find a way to hold the pocket down and throw the attention at Jesus. See, music is, as artists, and whatever your discipline is, whether it's sculpting, music, dance, whatever, it's the art of entertaining, and you have an audience. And Christian music and church music, I should say, it's the fine art of being that artist with and relinquishing the right to be the focus. And you've done it right when somebody comes up and says, you know, it's like God was sitting in the chair next to me. Then you've done your job. And
I agree.
I think that's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
And I will say,
that's what the voices in my head are saying.
I will say, though, I approach both the same as far as preparation, though. And again,
that doesn't give you the right to be slack. Absolutely.
Right. Exactly. I still woodshed both to death. Again, just because I'm not going to be a distraction in worship, and I also don't want to be the weakest link in the secular gig either. So I'm coming hyper prepared.
Well, yeah, in the secular gig, that means you don't get hired again.
Yeah,
if you do it wrong,
true.
You got to be on your game. True. You know, it's funny. It's and some of my kids ask me, like I have some of my students, and I've got a couple of them that I'm working really, really hard on sight reading music, being able to read standard notation, not just tabs. And they said, why do I need to learn all this stuff? They said, there's all this stuff on YouTube. I said, okay, I get it. But let me fill you in on a mistake I made here recently. And this happened just this last Sunday. I don't know if you read my post on Facebook, but I spent all week learning the acoustic guitar parts to this worship set. Planning Center said I was supposed to be playing bass.
Oops.
So I show up at church with my acoustic guitar and I don't have a bass. And they said, but you're playing bass today. I went, oh, man. Oops. So the drummer actually lived a few minutes away from church. He went home and got his bass. He had a bass. And it was an inexpensive little Samick, played like a tank, but it was a bass. It was a bass. And I had to sight read the entire service. And there were a couple choral anthems. Those suckers are never easy. All right. And I ended up sight reading the entire service. So I tell my kids, knowledge is power. You can get by without sight reading, but dude, this might buy you a gig somewhere down the road.
Right.
You got to be ready for it. And you're never going to get to a recording session and they're not going to put tab in front of you. They're going to put a chord chart. You got to know what that means. They might put,
right.
I was given an orchestral pit gig once where I was given a piano score. That's all they had. And I had to find guitar parts. I had to pull a guitar part out of the piano score. And so so finally some of my music theory nonsense in my head came to the front. Now, granted, that's been the only gig what's that?
Did you have to do it on the fly?
on the fly.
Wow.
They,
That's like, for me, that's like doing long division in my head.
it was. I spent my whole life waiting for this one moment, and I got it. Yes. And it didn't
Wow.
generate any more gigs. It didn't do anything for me except at that moment I went, yeah, I got this. It was at a the Perimeter Church in North Atlanta, and big PCA church, and their regular guitar player had gotten sick, and so they had an emergency call audition, and me and this other guitar player showed up for it, and he was a much better guitar player than I am. I know where I'm at on the food chain as a guitar player. I'm gonna be okay. That's it. But they put the music, piece of music in front of us, and he said, well, I don't read music really well, but if you give me the CD, I'll have it learned by tonight. And he could have done that. He has an incredible ear, no issues. They said, but we don't know you. Paige, can you read any of this? Sure. So I sight read some of it, and I got the gig. I got $200 to play guitar in an orchestra pit. They didn't amplify me. It was classical guitar. They didn't amplify me. I could have played Sweet Home Alabama all night long, and they never would have known. But because I could sight read and pull guitar chords out of a piano score, I made the easiest $200 I've ever made in my lilife.
That's awesome.
And that's the only time that's ever happened. Almost everything else is like you can get it off YouTube.
You talk about YouTube, and a lot of the young players I play with talk about YouTube, and every time they say something about, they can learn the part off of YouTube, I think of 13-year-old self sitting in front of the stereo. I'm trying to learn Do You Feel Like We Do? And I'm taking the needle and going back and listening to it, and taking the needle and going back and listening to it, and taking the needle and going back. And all these kids have to do is go to somewhere on YouTube. Some middle-aged pot-bellied pot smoker has broken down the tune into parts where he can show anybody, any monkey, how to play it. And I'm like,
it's like
wow.
It's like,
where were you when I needed you?
All right, you're gonna put your first finger on the 6th fret. All right, here we go. You're gonna hang out in these 4 frets. Yeah, and that's kind of how I learned the solo to More Than a Feeling.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many songs I learned either putting the needle back on the record or rewinding that cassette tape back and listening to it over and over and over.
And the horror and the sinking heart feeling in your heart when you scratch the needle across the record.
Yes.
Or
if you really needed that nickel that was weighing down the arm.
I only used it. I guess I only used a dime.
I must have had a worse, a lighter record arm than you did.
Well, all right. Well, so what would be the very last piece? You're on an elevator, young bass player. Maybe it could be the 13-year-old you, 14 or 15-year-old you, and you got like 2 minutes with them on the elevator. And what's the most important thing they need to know musically?
As far as from the bass approach?
Yeah.
I'd say that it's not a glamour instrument, so don't start playing bass because you think it's glamorous. But I consider, for lack of a better term, the bass the keystone of the band.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know about keystones, they're at the top of the arc, and that's what keeps the arc standing, because they're the piece that keeps the whole thing together. And I really feel like that's what bass is. Bass is the musical conduit from the melodic instruments to the rhythmic instruments.
Mm-hmm.
So you're in the middle bonding the two. And I think, not to take away from the other instruments, but I think that's an extremely important position. And let's put it this way, when a band has a good bass player, you don't notice. When a band has a bad bass player, you notice very quickly.
I had an old timer tell me once.
That's how to approach it.
He said, band's playing. And the people are dancing. Guitar player walks off stage, people are still dancing. Keyboard player stops playing, walks off stage, people are still dancing. If you're doing your job, young man, that drummer can walk off the stage and people are still dancing. But the minute the bass player walks off the stage, people stop.
That's true.
We're the reason
there's a meme. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. I want to hear that.
There's a meme that was popular on the interwebs, and it said, "You're not a fan of a band if you don't know the bass player's name." And part of me was like, you got a point, but the other part of me is like, if you don't care who the bass player is because the band sounds great, then you're just as much a fan because the bass player did their job, and nobody, you and I look for it because we hear something and go, man, who is that? So we're the dorks that read the liner notes and find out who people are. And
Yes.
but honestly, the folks that just enjoy the music, if they know who the bass player is, it's probably for a bad reason and not a good one.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, my friend, this has been a fun chat. First of all, I'm finally glad to catch up with you and talk, because it's like I said, we've been two ships passing in the night, and you're one of my favorite bass players in the worship community, and I always enjoyed when you were playing, because it was.
I take that as high praise, Paige. Thank you.
Oh, and I don't want to revisit one comment. You said you're not as accomplished a player as I am. Here's what you're saying. You don't know you're saying this. This is what you're saying. Paige, you got happy hands. I've got the bottom end. I got the groove. Dude, I admire your playing primarily because with you, it is about the groove. And I have to continually fight the happy hand syndrome, because I never found a hole in the music that I couldn't fill. And, and sometimes I get the stank eye from folks. And I've tempered it way back. I don't do it so much anymore. But, dude, if there's a hole in the music, I'm on whatever. So I admire your playing.
I could appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. That means a lot to me.
Well, we're going to have to do this again sometime. So
I'd enjoy that. That
would be a total fun time. And I would like us in the future, perhaps our next topic of conversation could be, I would like to hear more about what it's like to be you say you're a music director right now, right? At your church?
In some of the bands, the church bands, I was musical director. The one I'm in now doesn't require one, but it was some of the other churches that I've done it. It was a very interesting and challenging position, because not only do you have to keep what you're doing going, but you also have to coax the entire rest of the band along if technology fails you, or if you don't want to rely on technology and you want to go off and do something on the fly. You've got to be the one that makes sure that the band knows what direction you're going in, and they have got to follow. And that can be very challenging.
You know, and we can also visit the subject about Christians and non-Christians playing in a church band, because there's a very valid discussion about that. Handel, when he wrote Messiah, when he first performed it the difference between Bach and Handel was that Bach was quintessentially a church musician who did some secular things, but he primarily did most of his work in church and for church. Handel, on the other hand, was a Christian musician who did almost most of his work out in the secular arena, whether sacred or secular. And he would be, when he first couple performances of Messiah, he hired a soprano who was of questionable moral foundation. And she had quite a reputation for being a bit of a player that way. And he received a lot of criticism why she was singing. And his response was epic. He said, well, she can sing the part. That's one reason. But and then he said, but the other reason is, where else is this woman going to hear the gospel? She's not coming to your church.
That's a great point.
And so that might be a point of discussion down the road about integrate, is there a place for non-Christian musicians in a Christian music environment? And so put your thinking cap on about that. Next time we visit each other, we'll see if we can dance around that a bit.
How about conversely, as a Christian musician playing in secular situations with non-Christians, what's your possible effect in that situation as well?
Oh, I've got a great story about that. I'll tell you that right now. I was with the Rhythm Raiders, and I was a Christian, of course. And they had a guitar player, and this band was very cohesive, and we all respected each other. They respected my Christian faith, and they didn't. And I told them right off the bat. They start apologizing when they drop F-bombs. I said, "Look, guys, first of all, I'm in the Navy 16 years. You're never going to say anything that's going to offend me. I worked for the government for 16 years. You're never going to say anything that's going to offend me. And I don't care how many words you rhyme with duck. I'm cool with it. Just, I'm not going to say it, but hey, whatever. You're communicating. I'm good with that." So, but the guitar player, I ended up having to leave the group for health reasons. And the guitar player got back to me later and said that he had given his heart to Christ, primarily because of my being in that band. I said, how does that work? And he said, man, he says, like, you're the first legit Christian we had that wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. You know, it's like you accepted us where we were. And he says, and trust me, we talked about it when you weren't around.
Oh, wow.
And he gave us heart. And now he's a worship pastor in a church down in Florida.
Wow.
And he and I talk all together all the time. And but his whole thing was, he says, you loved the blues and you weren't snotty Christian-y about it. You grooved as great as any bass player I've ever had, and you were still a Christian at the end of the gig. And so I think I've done my job. If that's the end result.
If people can see him through you, then I'd say, yeah. What better praise can you get?
And I think perhaps that could be a good discussion to have. Christian
Absolutely.
Musician in a secular environment and a secular musician in a Christian environment. Can it happen? That'd be kind of cool.
It would be good.
Well, my friend, my next interview is coming up. So I appreciate this. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for asking me, Paige. I really enjoyed it. And I know we were only supposed to go half an hour, and we almost went an hour. So,
well, you know what?
We obviously went down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, here's the deal. I start off saying I want a half an hour, and every time this is what's happened, because there's about an hour's worth of discussion. That was a great conversation with my buddy Mark. I cut it off there because we nattered on for another few minutes about this, that, and the other thing. We're both grandparents, and we talked about our grandkids. I hope you enjoyed that. I did. And I think that's a good place to wrap this thing up. I'll see you at our next episode of For the Only One That Matters. Have a great day, y'all. Bye-bye.